Throughout metaphysical and philosophical literature, there's this idea of waking up from the dream, waking up out of the illusion, waking up in some ineffable way. And I wanted to talk about this in a little bit more concrete terms so that it's clear what the waking process is. So the first level of waking up in infancy is that I exist as a separate entity, as a separate identity than my parents and the world around me. And identities are habits of thinking, feeling, speaking, and doing. And so every identity, like a snowflake, is unique. It's a unique formation in relationship with its environment, particularly in the child innocence of that initial identity. There's the core energy, you could call it the kind of the nucleus of the self, that adapts and responds based on the environment that it's in order to meet the core needs of that individual, which start out with needing to matter and then move to needing to have some agency or regulation of that mattering and of impact, and then subsequently move in various experimentations towards the innate drive in each human being to feel sustainably better and avoid feeling chronically worse. So there's this hierarchy of development. I need to know that I matter. I need to know that I am in control, that I can have impact and agency. And then I need to, while staying in that feeling of agency and control, move from whatever state that I'm in, whatever level of well-being, to feeling better in a sustainable way. That's the hierarchy. And so an identity forms as a unique pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, and doing, based on a template that evolves over time with pleasure, desire, safety, love, etc., and trauma, fear, and pain on the other side. So our identity crystallizes based on our deepest hungers, our deepest desires, and values, and our deepest fears, our deepest pains, our deepest traumas. Those are the pivot points. And initially, in the unconsciousness of a spontaneous identity, initially, the waking up, particularly in our world, occurs through shock, through trauma, through dissociation, through pain, and the fear of that pain. There is a waking up. Will I be left alone? Will I still be loved? Am I safe? What if that big energy hits me again? There's a waking up through pain and the fear of pain, through trauma and the fear of trauma. But that awakening that often occurs in shock, the awareness of distinction, the awareness of identity, the awareness of fragility, also has a positive drive. I want to survive. I want to feel secure in that survival. I want to feel a sense of love and belonging. I want to become the person I dream of being. I want a sense of self-esteem. I want to develop my unique gifts and discover where I'm unique and the unique contribution I want to make. I want to bring those gifts out into the world and matter in a positive way, not just matter by screaming or having a tantrum as a 5-year-old or whatever, but matter in a uniquely positive way. And I want that abundance of having a positive impact in many people's lives. I want that to ripple out and touch as many people as possible. And I want to become part of something bigger than myself. And so the identity is formed sometimes more by trauma and fear. This develops more of a sociopathic identity, because the more traumatized an infant is, the more sociopathic its environment, as a general rule. Sustained traumatic energy is not tolerated in exposure towards an infant unless there is either incompetence on the part of the surrounding people, or it is a relatively sociopathic culture. Because in the sociopathic ethic, the strong prey on the weak. In the reptilian brain, the big consume the small. In the empathic brain, so you have the sociopathic, reptilian, you have the limbic, you have the rational, then you have the empathic, and then you have the transcendent. When you move to the empathic centers of the brain, the strong protect the weak. The old protect the young, the middle-aged protect the very old. Those who have more are in service to those who have less. That's the law of empathy. The law of the reptile is the crocodile brain. So the more trauma and sustained predation that an infant, child, adolescent experiences, it's one of the reasons why there's a correlation between children and adolescent boys who have been sexually molested repeatedly by an older man and heinous crimes that get juveniles put to death in our country. In one study, more than 60% of the boys that we execute or murder on death row in a year, more than 60% of those boys were repeatedly sexually abused by an older man, meaning when you are exploited by someone bigger than you, your brain says you don't need an empathic brain. You need to survive in a reptilian culture. You need fight, flight, freeze. You need a strong reptilian program. The reptilian program says run from what's bigger than you because it'll hurt you, and hurt and consume what's smaller than you because you can. That's a reptile. The child's experience is on a continuum between the reptilian program and the empathic program. Depending on where it is in that continuum, every traumatic event stimulates the reptilian brain. And the need for identity, a habit, primary identity, is often the identity that helps the person survive the worst case scenario. One of the reasons that the brain is predisposed to negativity, which we can observe easily by going to a party and 5 people tell you how nice you look and one person tells you you look dumpy and old, and you immediately ignore the 5 people. So you've got 5 to 1 positive feedback, and That's out the window. Why does the brain dwell on the worst event? Why do children's identities crystallize not around the best thing their parents ever did to them, but by the worst thing? Why does the identity coagulate around the lowest common denominator in the child experience rather than the midpoint, the average, or the highest common denominator? And if you understand life's drive to survive, you can take this into technical terms and say, would you like to build your house for the 1-week earthquake, the average earthquake, or the 100-year earthquake? Would you like to build your house for the 1-week flood, the seasonal flood, the 10-year flood, or the 100-year flood? Would you like the boat that you're sailing off across the Atlantic on to be able to handle the calmest of days and medium weather and a light storm? Or would you like that boat to be able to handle the worst weather that could come up? And an identity is like a ship. You want a ship that sets off into the unknown, that sets off on a journey to be able to handle the worst case scenario that it might encounter. Because if it can handle that, it can still deal with the best case scenario. A hurricane-proof yacht, for example, doesn't sink because it's sunny, but a beautiful but poorly designed rowboat, tugboat, whatever, that does beautiful in very calm weather but sinks and drowns everyone in worse weather is a problem, because from time to time worse things do happen. And so an identity is like a ship. And the child that's entering traumatic terrain has to ask themselves a rational question. If mommy did this once, is it likely she would do this again? If Uncle Joe did this once, what if Uncle Joe did it again? What if he did it again and again and again? Because it's now on the event horizon as a probability. I may need to deal with another man trying to molest me. Now, it only happened once, but that's enough to say that every older body could be a threat. Now, the helplessness, the deceit, the fear, perhaps the intimidation, if you tell someone, I'll kill your dog, whatever it is, because we're clearly not dealing with an adult, right? Adults do not prey on children. Adolescents in adult bodies do, or grown-up bodies. Children in grown-up bodies do. Mental emotional disease, traumatic reenaction patterns in grown-up bodies molest children. Adults do not. So we realize that we're dealing with maybe a shame-based, sexually repressed adolescent. Maybe a 6-year-old who was molested repeatedly, either psychologically, where that innocence was raped and ripped away. They've never been able to find that again, so they're drawn to it in a child that still has what they've lost. Maybe the rape was psychological. And I want to be connected to that me before that was taken away. And the only way I know how to do that is by doing to another 6-year-old what was done to me at 6 years old, through sustained and repetitive humiliation, through ostracization, through being physically or psychologically raped of my innocence. The pain is such that I can't go into that pattern. It's so painful. But I can reenact it in a detached way, the same kind of detached way that I allowed it to happen when I realized I wasn't big enough to stop it. So, a child that's experienced a worst-case scenario needs to come up with a question: how do I stop this from happening again and again and again? And until they've answered that question, then the bigger question, do I have a ship that can sail out into the unknown and life, is not answered effectively. Until I have a response that is likely to work in the worst case scenario events that I've experienced or watched. Daddy didn't molest me, he molested my older sister. And I didn't know what to do about it. I didn't know how to help her. I tried to tell Mom, she hit me. I couldn't stop it, and there's nowhere I can go for help. I couldn't stop it, and there's nowhere I can go for help. The habit of shaking, of freezing, of weeping under the covers is an identity. It's a habit of thinking, feeling, speaking, and doing that is impotent in the face of the traumas we've experienced. And if we've experienced those traumas and do not have an effective ship to move through them or respond to them, then we have a certain degree of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Meaning the equation keeps presenting itself. We relive the memory. What do you do when this happens? I don't know. I hide under the covers. What do you do when this happens? I don't know. I don't want to be hit. What do you do when this happens? The equation, the calculator of development, spits out the equation again and again and again until we have an identity worthy of encountering that particular trauma, that particular pain, that particular grief, and say, this time I can be empowered. This time I can survive that particular cruelty. Because as long as life throws me curveballs that my identity is incapable of surviving intact, that's what trauma is. It's a rupture of identity. It's a pinball colliding with a bowling ball and bouncing off a cliff somewhere. Because it can't hold its own in the law of mass. The law of mass that says when a pinball and a bowling ball collide, the pinball goes flying. The bowling ball absorbs the energy of the pinball and continues in its trajectory slightly slower if there was an oppositional collision. But the pinball is just thrown for a loop, completely scattered, and understands in that moment, anytime I collide with a bowling ball, I lose. The bowling ball doesn't stop. The bowling ball doesn't consult. The bowling ball plows through. And if I try and hold to my authentic course, I am thrown further away than if I bow out of the way and accommodate the bowling ball inauthentically, adaptively, to survive. If I agree to this thing that I don't like, if I pretend that it's fine, then the bowling ball doesn't hit me. But I have another problem. I've lost touch with myself, with the identity that was there before. So the first waking up process is of distinction. I am a me as an identity separate from. The second waking up is usually, to the extent that we have a large unconscious set of programs that are highly sociopathic in our culture, that the equation, the algorithm, the cult to which we belong is not fair, it's not healthy, it has sociopathic elements. Shut up because I said so. Stop doing that or I'll hit you. Well, if you go up against that enough and get battered down every single time, not by someone more intelligent, not by someone kinder or wiser, just someone bigger, then you develop the adaptive identity, a new pattern that is capable of surviving through a certain contract, a certain abuse pattern with a bigger abuser. That's when the small criminals line up with the more powerful criminals to serve as lackeys in a shared goal that doesn't put them head to head with the mob, with the boss, with the dad, with the uncle who's got all the money, whatever it is, with the teacher, with the principal, with your government. You form an adaptive alliance that is a contract of survival. So now you've got a waking up into the conscious adaptive identity. And there is a death to some extent, often before language, of the authentic identity. The identity that we optimally wanted to become before we colluded with sociopathic elements in our environment that downgraded that potential, that left us with an equation we needed to solve. I know what I'll do when the Nazis come knocking and threatening and looking for Jews. I'll help them. I'll expose someone. I'll be an informant. And then I'll be safe. And then I'll be liked. I'll get rank. And I'll be more popular. I'll get more cigarettes, whatever it is. The adaptive identity is something we wake up into or unconsciously fall into. And then there's the awakening of self-awareness, which is not actually awareness of the self, it's awareness of the identity. So now we have a new awakening. And the awakening is, who am I? Oh, I am the one who prefers to buy $6 Starbucks rather than give to the hungry. I drive by homeless people every day. I don't have money for them. I give to Starbucks. I'm the one who always picks up litter and hates other people for being so selfish. because that's what I do every day. There's another one, those selfish people, I pick it up. I'm the one who, I'm better than that. I don't judge other people because I'm superior to other people. I don't think any negative thoughts. I just wish the world was a nicer place, people like me, but let's not judge anyone. Of course, I'm the best one. And do this. I'm the one who does this. What is the pattern? What are your patterns? What do you think? What do you feel? What do you say? What do you do? And with what attitude? It's part of the identity. It has a certain flavor. So I am the one who does this. This is my pattern. That's me. I am the identity. No, it's not me that you haven't woken up to who the identity is. What's the script of the identity? And how does that script benefit the identity in its journey of survival, security, love and belonging, self-esteem, developing gifts, etc.? What trajectory is that identity on? Now, here's a very important thing to understand about identity. All identities are formations in response to their environment. The identity is a vehicle for surviving, increasing security of survival, etc., in that environment. And once it's formed, in response to the question, how do I survive this most horrible event? How do I get closer to feeling good and avoiding feeling chronically bad? Once it's formed, some identities are bullying identities. I've got a big body. My dad taught me how to bully me, so I know the technique. And so I look for people that are as small to me as I am to my dad or my uncle or my boss. And I bully and make them feel the way that I was feeling. And I know how to do it because, well, that's how they did it to me. And I know how they feel because that's how I felt. But there's now symmetry, right? I get bullied by you, you get bullied by me. Takes the pressure off. I don't feel so alone because I know you're feeling to me the way I feel to him or her. So there's a certain integrity in that mirroring of the software handed down, being modeled, being imprinted. So there's bullying survival tactics, there's victim survival tactics. Every time I would scream, my mother would finally come in and give me attention. So I kind of liked it when my older sister abused me because then I would scream and I'd get some attention that I wouldn't get if my sister didn't abuse me. And then my sister would get less attention or she'd be sent to her room and then it'd be all about me. So I look for people to hurt me and then I complain and scream how rotten it is, and then I look for people who will say, oh, you poor thing, here, let's help you, and then I survive. I feel secure. I have a sense of love and belonging. I have a sense of self-esteem. I feel closer. I know how to do it. It works. Or I'm the loner. I wait for someone to court me and negotiate with me. Please be part of our group. I'm not interested. What do we have to do to interest you? Well, you can perform. Throw out some options. I'll let you know. I'm just going to isolate myself until someone courts me and gives me enough perks to belong to their group. Non-committally, of course. And then I'll threaten to withdraw, or I'll do that in relationship. I'll wait for someone to get attached to me. And I'll say, maybe if you do this for me, maybe you do that for me. Maybe I'll stick around. I don't know. I'm a free soul. I'm going to get as much that I possibly can from you out of the threat of withdrawing at any moment. And it's your fault because I never promised anything. So all these identities are survival-based coping mechanisms. Now, the sociopathic aspects of the identity correlate with the sociopathic aspects in the environment in which the identity was formed. Every cult in human history, of which there have been 10,000 cultures, is dysfunctional, imperfect, has sociopathic elements, and is inefficient in transmuting energy into sustainable well-being in some areas. Every cult is flawed. The flaws of a dominant cult have to be encountered and responded to in the individual and in the identity that forms around the individual in order to hold space, to survive, feel secure. For example, if you're dealing with a crocodile, which is where the reptilian brain comes from, it's 200 million years old reptilian brain, 200 million years old, crocodiles roamed the earth. Well, a crocodile, if they see anything smaller that they can eat with and have a good chance of surviving, they attack it. You see, a crocodile doesn't see a 2-year-old child say, oh, isn't that cute? We should be nice to such an innocent 2-year-old. Now, if there are some adults and a 2-year-old, and the crocodile has a choice of who to attack, the crocodile is focused on risk assessment, much like Microsoft. If Microsoft has to take on Google or has to take on some little startup that doesn't have a good legal defense fund, Microsoft was named the 800-pound gorilla because it would plow in and bully companies out of existence by buying them, and in some cases shutting them down because it's not hard to have superior software than Microsoft, particularly at the time. Same with Oracle. PeopleSoft, a great place to work, in many ways a superior piece of software, eating into Oracle, but Oracle's big. It can devastate and crush and intimidate the clients and the company to grind it up, right? So we're talking about crocodiles. Crocodiles prey on the weak, on the young, on infants. They are completely sociopathic. Now, the identity that wins or survives an experience with a crocodile is a reptilian identity. It's not a pleasing, how lovely to see you identity. If you're unconditionally loving to a crocodile, oh, aren't you sweet? Here, I'll give you some food. You're hungry? I'll give you some food. Just don't bite my hand, right? Forget it. Unless you have an iron bar, scare the crocodile shitless, shoot it in the head with a 45-degree revolver, there's no reciprocity in a crocodile. That crocodile waits for the opportunity to devour, to kill, to maim anything that it can. And if it succeeds, it grows bigger and lasts longer than less effective reptiles, than less effective sociopaths. So whether you're dealing with a reptilian country, a reptilian company, a reptilian paradigm, it's called free market capitalism. Free market capitalism, where 90% of all new ventures fail and are going to fail again and again to be consumed in a winner-take-all. in a winner-take-all economy where the big get bigger, the strong get stronger, the rich get richer, as far as they can take that. Until what? Another big alligator jumps in and says, no, we're going to break up this monopoly. You're getting too big to be a constructive sociopath. But competition is good. It's just at some point, you're a monopoly and we'll break you up with another monopoly. Government has a monopoly on violence, a monopoly on printing money. We're going to use our power to bully or collude. Let us get elected and we'll pass bills that let you bully the small ones, and we'll both be big ones bullying the small ones. The identity that can survive the reptile is a reptilian identity. It's run like hell. That's reptilian. Fight, flight, and freeze. The crocodile's coming. I don't have a 45 Magnum revolver. I'm not good with knifing crocodiles in close quarters. I'm not a good judo master, so I'm running. Flight. Or I do. And I'm going to kill that son of a bitch before it kills me. Reptilian thinking. Well, the identity that is dominant will relate to the primary experiences of that individual, reptilian or otherwise. And so you can understand the environment through the statistical awareness of the individual, and you can understand your environment through the statistical analysis of identities. Because we don't just have one identity. We have an identity at a party. We have an identity when we're determined to fuck someone no matter what the cost or anything else. We have an identity when we're scared and trying to get out of it. We have an identity when we're feeling generous and want to impress people. We have an identity when we feel innocent and just joyful to be alive. We have an identity that when we feel inspired and we're meeting one of our great heroes, we have a different pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, and doing for each of these occasions. And schizophrenia comes in when there's no relationship, no cohesive connecting bond or algorithm that connects these disparate identities, these disparate patterns. How can I be a good Christian at church, then ignore the homeless, and go collude with a sociopathic government to make more laws that increase the cost of housing when our people are going homeless? There's no cohesiveness between those identities. The meek shall inherit the earth, and I will punish the meek in every way possible in my other role. I'll pray here, I'll do this. Well, when you have that degree of schizophrenia, you either have extreme multidimensional schizophrenia, or you have mental schizophrenia but physical integrity. I may go to Sunday and bow and do this and that, but I never give more than a few bucks to the collection. All my real money is invested in sociopathic ventures. So I just don't like recognizing that about myself. So I go and do this. And I send more of my defenses and my headspace over to here, even though 90% of the time I'm not in that church and 95% of my money goes over here. My real prayer is in my daily life, my money, my choices, but I'm thinking about it. I'm a great Christian from time to time in my mind. So we have schizophrenia in those identities that can be, if it's on all levels, being a rabbi and then going and killing people in the, on your spare time. Well, you can't connect the dots. You don't really know how those two parts relate. Well, the more schizophrenic our environment, the more schizophrenic our identities. If you had parents that read the Bible to you while they beat you, while they raped your sister, while they shut up and silenced any truth tellers, and they have a convincing Bible persona and an effective sociopathic dominator persona, and they never brought those two together, you've got two schizophrenic environments. They don't talk to each other, and they're not integrated. So you've got to develop two separate programs to survive each of those environments, and you can't talk about it. Because to talk about the discrepancies and inconsistencies between your identities is to acknowledge and talk about the insanity and hypocrisy in your parents' identities and the reality they're creating. And in most abusive environments, it is absolutely taboo to speak the truth. You will be punished, you will be hit, you will be disowned for telling the truth that weakens the power structure of a dysfunctional power figure, of a dysfunctional authority. So you've now developed schizophrenic identities to integrate with schizophrenic people around you, because you need this identity when they're being like this, and you need this identity when they're being like this, and you need another identity to hide the discrepancy. So you run like hell when dad's drunk. You pretend that dad's not drunk, he's a great person. And you come up with lies to talk about why you always run away from dad, or why you're never available when he's drunk and wants to hit you or rape you or whatever it is. So you have the survival identity, the pleasing identity, and the one that hides that there's anything to survive. Well, if that's kept you alive, and it's devastating to your abuser or your culture or your government to deal with the truth. Like, why is Edward Snowden enemy number one? Because he told the truth about the schizophrenic nature of his cult. We're all about democracy. We're all about the rule of law. We're all about human rights and the Constitution. Except when we're not. Except when we throw out the law, the Constitution, lie to you, and use public money against you, and then hunt down anyone who exposes our corruption. And we do it all, what? For your own good. Sound familiar? The parental schizophrenia, the governmental schizophrenia results in a schizophrenia in the child that, if not diagnosed by the child and disintegrated and then reintegrated, results in a chronic intergenerational abuse cycle, where I'm schizophrenic in the same way that my parents were, and you're going to have to become schizophrenic as my child, or I will disown you the same way my parents threatened to disown me when I started to wake up to the hypocrisy, when I threatened to see the unforgivable truth that is there, when I challenge what's there, then we have the unforgivable dynamic. So, I just dealt with a client today who likes to pretend they're this wonderful, easygoing client and really cool and stuff, and yet every single time they can do anything to get a discount, to get more for nothing, to get you to do more and they do less. There's 5 or 6 different programs running, but the common denominator beneath those programs is we want more and we don't want to pay for it. And we want you to look bad so that we can look good while being incredibly cheap and manipulative. Now, we all have something like that going on to some degree in some situations. This client just happens to have more of that than at least 90% of the difficult clients that I've dealt with in 27 years in contracting. Even while I'm pointing that out, they were so offended. How could you point out our cheapness? I can't listen to it. Now let's get back to being cheap and ignoring all the things that you've done above our agreement and niggling this. How could you say that? Now let's get back to, could you give us a discount here? The guy at one point said, you're a big company. Why don't you just write it off? It's nothing to you. It's like no one's ever said that to me in 27 years. But then he's immediately offended at the idea that he's cheap. Cheap for doing 20 separate things to try and get more for less? Me? So it's, then you have the rupture of the relationship for exposing the pattern that is taboo in some sense. I want to look like this because that's beneficial, but I want to behave like this because that's beneficial. If I could just look good and get more money and more discounts and not do it, then I've got the best of both worlds. And if I can just convince you to look over here, where I'm being all magnanimous and all that, and not look over here, if you'll just go along with that, there'll be benefits for you. He promised high reviews, right? But he was worse at that than most clients. So it's like the promise. The clients that give great reviews don't try and negotiate discounts for great reviews and give better reviews. So you have the identity of the manipulative client in this case. Now, what is the identity that I developed to deal with the manipulative client? Well, one is truth-telling. Let's actually look at the contract before you play the victim martyr game. This is ahead. I did this and it's not in the contract. Do you want to pay for that? I did this. Do you want to pay for that? I did this. Do you want to pay for that? No, you don't want to pay for any of those freebies, right? And then I've done what is in the contract, but you want something extra. That's called cheap. Oh, I'm not cheap. I just think, could you do a little bit more for my wife? So you don't care about your wife enough to pay for the work that you want done? You want someone else to care more about your wife? If your wife is so important, why don't you make the money to pay for your wife? So that's an identity in response to an identity. We have a manipulative wheedling, this and that and the other. And we have this identity. Or we have a pleaser identity. I've done that one too. Oh, sure, I don't want to deal with their bullshit. Let's just do extra. So we have the pleaser identity. But when the manipulator identity is sociopathic, the pleaser identity ultimately feels used and small, which is why I then developed the truth-telling identity, because I didn't like feeling used and small. So the identity is always in response to the environment. Now, where did his manipulating and wheedling come from, and his wife's? They had different angles, and they'd play off of each other. It was fascinating to watch because I gave them more discounts than I've given any single client, and they complained after all that more than any single client, and still felt terribly put upon. You know, you could point out in the contract, show me one thing I haven't done in the contract, and let me show you 20 that aren't in the contract that I've done. Oh, we don't have time to listen to all this, right? It's a burden for them to have to hear the litany of their abuses. They're busy people, right? So it's, how do you have the waking up to the identity. Here's me in bitterness. This is a bitter identity. This is a funny identity. There's a humor in it, right? It's laughable to watch people, for some identities to stay stable and cohesive, you have to ignore 90% of reality and focus on 10%. And it's very funny, right? You know, there's a funny element to someone standing surrounded by $4,000 of discounts and saying, yeah, I understand all that, but here, could you do $300 more? I'm not happy. I'm just not happy because you haven't done this other thing that isn't in the contract either, but I'd be really happy if you would do that. It's laughable. You have to ignore 90% of reality and focus on a 10% that's not only very tiny, it's fictitious. So, but people are great at this. If we have a victim identity, we can remember the times when we were victimized 10 years ago and suddenly we're a victim again because we remembered it. We put it back together. I really am a victim. See, that did happen 10 years ago. Oh, it's terrible. I feel terrible. Oh. But you could also remember something that was wonderful that happened 5 years ago, but it wouldn't reinforce the identity. My identity as a put-upon victim. And so these identities interact together as a cohesive mesh of survival-based protocols. And there's somewhat on autopilot, and there's some creativity. I always have to find fault, but with you I'll find fault over there because you don't have any faults here, so I'll just look over here and I'll find faults over there. And with you I'll find the faults over here. So, and there's some new moves, you know, to develop to still be a victim or still be stronger or still be right. I'm always right. No, you don't understand. Even though I was wrong there, I was right about the general theory. So I'm still right. So I'm always right. And that's my identity. And so I'll fiddle around, ignore stuff, and open up. So, and of course, trauma-based identities are more brittle because they're more frightened of falling apart. See, the more you've been helpless in your identity, the more you can fall apart because it's not very stable. Every time you asserted no one's going to mess with me, then your older brother said, oh yeah? Pulled on your ear, gave you a wedgie, threw cold water. You tried to reestablish the identity. No one's going to mess with me. Oh yeah? He does it again. He knocks your authentic warrior down every single time, because why should you have it when it was knocked out of him by dad? Now I'm going to knock it out of you. So it's a very fragile. So that 30-year-old, when he says, no one's going to mess with me, there's a part of him that feels despair. Says, who am I talking about? Everyone's going to mess with me. No matter, as soon as I even say this, it just means I'm going to be beaten up. Where's Big Brother? Where is he now? Is he my boss? It's hopeless. So there's, but I need some sense of control. You know, this is sometimes when people get desperate and violent and shoot someone. You know, it's like, no one's going to mess with me. Tired of it. Oh, and then they get a little respect, right? Because they got a gun in a cult that otherwise knocked them down, knocked them down, knocked them down, knocked them down again and again and again. So you have the cynical identity, the disgust of our sociopathic cult, which of course can find plenty of food for that identity. So every identity is a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, and doing that looks at and relates to different memories, different aspects of reality, and develops a sustainable relationship with that helps them survive, feel secure, etc. So the next waking up is to wake up to that identity. I am this pattern in relationship to these memories and these things, and these people and these things. That's me. I am this, I know it, I can predict how I will behave, I understand who I am in relationship to my past and in relationship with my present. Now this is where we get into this more esoteric, the term waking up. It's at this stage. So I know I'm self-aware of my identity. I know how it functions, I've polished it, I know it inside and out. It's conscious. This is me. I am a machine who thinks, feels, speaks, and does this for these, and these reasons. In this situation, that's me. But the identity is a role in a play. The environment is the play. The identity is the role. But there is an author of the play, there is an author of the environment, and there's an author of the identity. And that's the next stage of waking up. And you could call it the witness. It's core to Buddhism, the awareness of the witness. Stephen Covey talked about the power of our humanity exists in the space between stimulus and response, environment and identity. This is the cause, and this is the reaction, the response. The environment hits me with a forest fire. I run like hell, screaming fire. This is the larger mass. This is the smaller mass that adapts and correlates like a pinball negotiating with a bowling ball in order to survive. This is the domain. The relationship between stimulus and response. And there's a part that emerges as consciousness in the space between stimulus and response. It's called meditation. It's called Buddhism. It's called waking up, that there is someone in that space that is bigger than the identity that flows out of it. There is an ocean out of which the mask of identity has been formed. There is a possibility field out of which the infinite variations of identity emerge and crystallize. And when we become primarily conscious of the observer of the dance, is the moment we have woken up to the reality of the dance. When we become primarily identified as the witness of identity and the witness of environment, we become awake to a freedom to transcend the environment and transcend the identity. Because every victim looks for a bully in the past, the future, or the present to maintain its identity, because victim has no basis without a bully. If there's no bully, there's no victim. You can't say, I'm a victim of nothing. If you say, I'm a victim of God's cruel joke, I'm a victim of my Uncle Harry, you should have seen him. I'm a victim of Barbara Streisand. She didn't even give me the time of day. She was my heroine. I drove all this way to see her. She blew me off as if I was nobody. I'm a victim. These horrible, powerful people, inconsiderate. They have to be there for victimhood to sustain itself. Now, there's the child, adolescent, adult dynamic. And what we're dealing with here in this waking up is the process of adulthood. We're not discounting the stage of childhood in which you feel like a victim, you are a victim, and it is appropriate for you to behave like a victim. No 6-year-old should be asking themselves, what's wrong with me? They're doing that already. Why am I so unlovable? That people treat me like this and don't honor my body's boundaries and limitations. A 6-year-old is doing that already inappropriately. They lack the mass, the competency, the independence for that to be an appropriate question. But they ask it anyways. Every 6-year-old blames themselves for the abuses that are directed at them and weigh how unlovable they are by their own assessment based on the level of cruelty towards them, because dad and the big world out there couldn't possibly make a mistake. But as an adult, to understand, there are every color of the rainbow out there. So I can pair up with bullies and be the victim, or I could pair up with playful people and be playful. If I understand that I'm writing the script, if I understand this is my role, and I'm deeply in the part, but I wake up and I realize it's a part, it's a play that is predictable. I go and do this, I pick these things, I don't assert this boundaries, I get victimized. Then I go through my whole thing of strengthening my victim identity. Then I go do this, and then the other. My victim identity maybe gets a little weak. It's been a while since I've been victimized, so I'm going to go out and do this and this and this, and you see? Or I'm just going to dwell on the past. Everything's wonderful outside, but could you believe it, what they did 10 years ago? Oh, so ungrateful. You have no idea. Come back into the past 10 years. I'll recount it. So devastated. So but there's a waking up. There's a waking up to both the environment and the identity. A becoming of the witness and the soul, or the ocean, or the feminine, out of which every snowflake, every mask is formed. And I can see myself in the role, and I can enjoy the role. But people who have woken up have a certain sense of humor about the role. It's not quite so righteous. You can tell if you pay close attention, I'm in my role of a grieved contractor. Another customer didn't understand this and that. But there's a little bit in there, right? That says, this is funny. Why play that identity? What about this? How could we playing another script, right? Who's another client we could play with? Because there's this other client who insists on paying more, on doing this, but it just doesn't form my primary identity because I know how to deal with very generous clients. But I don't know how to deal with incredibly manipulative this and that and the other clients. So how am I going to deal with that? How is my identity going to survive the worst case scenario? So I'm dwelling. And I've made some changes, rewritten my contract for future clients to tighten up some exploitative loopholes where I thought I was being nice, but instead got hammered in those gray areas. And so there's, but even that, I've been hammered in those gray areas. See, that's an identity. If I believe that thought, it produces feelings. And you can see how my body changes. It blocks something more beautiful. It obscures something that wants to wake up, that's beautiful and filled with gratitude. That's waking up.